Hey besties, how are we doing? Are you feeling like sad all the time, but also like angry most of the time, and just like surviving out of spite and full of a lot of fear all the time? Well, we're in the same boat. So let's talk about the Titanic. A lot of people keep asking me, like, girl, why the Titanic? Why are you spending so much time on this tragedy when the rest of the world is also feeling like a tragedy right now? Because, well, I don't need to say why. And the answer to that is that stories from the Titanic, when you put the Titanic on a human scale, which a lot of people struggle to do, which I'll definitely get into, but I don't know if it's the movie or just, I don't know what, but when you go back and you go back to first-hand accounts from the Titanic, when you check out like this book that I've been reading, you're left with feeling a really balanced perspective, which is something I think we're all desperate for right now. There's a balance of the stories are hopeful and horrible. You know it's a tragedy. You know it's horrible. You know life is fragile, and this puts it into the extremely human terms, but it also, people can be so brave and so kind and so full of love and so true to themselves and their hearts. And I think right now we all need reminders of that without the, everything will be fine. I don't know about you, but a lot of people have been saying that to me, or like trying to say that to me, like, oh, sweetie, everything's terrible. Yeah, no, you're just being, everything's gonna be fine, or it's just not gonna affect you. Like, stop. It's already not fine. It's already very not fine for a lot of people in this country, particularly women, particularly people of color, particularly people in the LGBTQ plus community. Like, it's already terrible. So do not tell me everything will be fine. But yes, there are still moments of beauty, of hope. And that's why the Titanic keeps coming back to me right now, because you're on a sinking ship and there's already people in the water, but it's still one of the most beautiful night skies you've ever seen. Like, genuinely, one of the first stories in here is a guy who is like an amateur astronomer, and he just does not stop talking about the stars for a while. And actually, he's the reason they figured out that there was this incredible weather phenomenon that was going on that night. Like, there were so many things it took for the Titanic to sink. Like, so many things had to go wrong, including this like weather phenomenon. But anyways, I've mentioned this book before. I'd been reading it since actually the 4th of July, but I had also set up a post-election plan for myself that I didn't think I would. My plan was to go to this Titanic exhibition. It's a traveling exhibition called Titanic the Artifacts exhibit. And I would go the Saturday after the election. It's in Boston, and I plan to go there because I said to myself, either I'm going to be in a terrible, like, emotional state anyways, so anything about, this horrible human tragedy won't really affect me that much, or I'm going to be in such an okay place that I'll be fine to deal with it. So it wasn't like I was in some middling ground. I wasn't expecting, obviously, a lot of people weren't. Anyways, so it really worked out. So we're going to talk about the Titanic. I'm going to talk about that exhibit because, wow, yeah, okay. The expectations I had for the exhibit were on two sides. One, I expected it to be really, like, touristy. I expected it to be really mass marketed because it's a traveling exhibition of the Titanic. Like, that alone does not sound very, respectful, but maybe that's just caught up in, everyone's ideas of museums and things, that they are these hallowed institutions and whatnot. So So I admit there was a bit of prejudice just because of that, walking in. But I also was expecting to be underwhelmed because I haven't even finished this book. I'm not even halfway through this book. And I've learned so much from just what I've read that I am already, like, I walked in not expecting them to have new information for me. But they did. I was so delightfully surprised by the exhibition itself. There were other things I was incredibly horrified and disappointed by, but we'll get to those. So it's a traveling exhibition, so they just take up whatever space they can. I know someone who went to it in Vegas in like a casino ballroom or something once, but for being a traveling exhibition, it's incredibly well done. Even if this was an exhibition in a museum, I would still think it was incredibly well done. It was very, very accessible, first of all. As someone who has a degree in museum studies, that's something that is really important to me, both like physically accessible, for wheelchair strollers, whatever, but also like academically accessible, especially because the Titanic is kind of like, can I call it a pop culture tragedy? Because that's what it seems like it is. A lot of people come to the Titanic with just the movie in mind and not like actual history or like the actual, significance of class on the Titanic. But so the exhibit did an incredible job of being accessible, whether you know genuinely nothing about the Titanic or you know everything about the Titanic. So when you walk in, you're handed a boarding pass, a ticket that tells you which passenger you are on the Titanic. I loved this. I thought this was brilliant because it immediately puts the human scale, it puts it in your hands, literally. I ended up being one of the most famous passengers on the Titanic. My mom was someone I didn't know, so that was delightful to see what happened to her. But I was someone whose story I knew from this. But even then, there were details about her life I didn't know. It was Lady Astor, who had married into the very rich New York Astor family. And her husband, she was his second wife. She was 18. He was 47. 18. I spent a lot of the exhibit just processing that. My mom was another first-class passenger, so I told her, it's a pretty high chance that you survive. But it was fascinating to find out what actually happened to her. So the flow of the exhibit was, first of all, incredibly immersive. So there were rooms set up like traditional exhibitions where there are actual objects. That's the most important and coolest part of this exhibit. Actual objects from the Titanic, not replicas, nothing, like actual things they dug up from the bottom of the sea. I had no idea just how much stuff they have dug up from the bottom of the seabed, because there's stuff filling museums from the Titanic, and then there's this traveling exhibition, and they had so much stuff. They had, well, I'll get into what they had, because the flow was also just so well done. It was so immersive. They had parts of like replica parts of the ship. So like you walk into like the first class hallways, which was so cool. They had, of course, the very famous grand staircase where you could like take a picture, and like there was some kitschy touristy parts, but you know what? The rest of it was so good. I'll give them the photo op. I'll give them that, because people were going to be doing it anyways. So that was just so immersive and so cool and so in front of your face, and literally brought it to life. Right beside the actual living pieces. There were again, I'll get into it. I want to cover the important thing of the flow of the exhibition, which was the flow of the exhibit was so well done. It was like, okay, here's the before, here's them building the ship, here's what you need to know, here's like real quotes from people before they boarded the ship, and then you walk in and you're like on the ship, and then you start in the first class area. So they have so many like a replica room for first class and real artifacts from first class passengers, just all mixed within there. And it was so cool. They had a first class toilet. I don't know why they rescued a toilet from the Titanic, but that's awesome to see that. They had pictures from all the different fancy first class amenities. They had Turkish baths on there, like a huge giant spa. It was insane. And again, so much I didn't know. I read plenty of this. This has a giant model of the ship on the front, and there's so much I didn't know. They had real jewelry from passengers. They had so much. It was so cool. And then from there, you flow into the lower classes. So there wasn't much on the second class, but then they did like a replica of a third class room, which was really incredible to see. And then they did they built like a fake boiler room. I wish they'd like made it hotter in there so you could really get a sense of just how miserable working in a boiler room was. But in there, they also had other artifacts of pieces of the ship, pieces of machinery they used. And they had just the most incredible, like, the thing that sticks with me the most, the object the most, was a bottle of champagne with champagne still inside of it. Because when it sunk 6,000 feet below the surface, the pressure actually put the cork even more inside the bottle and protected champagne from the Titanic inside this bottle for over 100 years. That took my breath away. That was incredible. There were also really interactive parts of the exhibit that made it really accessible. So there was, like I said, you got a ticket that said who you were, and at the end, you could scan your ticket and find out not just whether you survived or not, but the story of what happened to you. So my mom's card was a first-class female passenger, and there were only like 3 or 4 women first-class passengers that died, and she was one of them. She was a mother who was traveling with her 2 kids, infant children, and she went down with the ship because she was desperately searching for her son. She couldn't find her son, and she was not leaving that ship without her son. And her son, incidentally, had been taken by the nanny and was already on a lifeboat. So she perished with the rest with her daughter and her husband. And just incredible. Like, and this is what frustrates me about the movie. Like, yeah, it's a great movie, and yeah, it's really immersive, and yeah, you know, Leonardo DiCaprio. But like, you have a story like that about a mother's love, and that's just a romance is the best you could come up with. A diamond necklace. Like, there were real stories in here that are so astounding. One of the stories in here that continue to haunt me is the last lifeboat on the Titanic was flipped over, and they couldn't flip it back, so a bunch of men just crawled onto the back and were just kind of essentially straddling it and like half in the water for the whole night. And they packed themselves on there like back to back to back, and they started paddling away from other people still in the water because they couldn't take any more, and it was so difficult for them to say, "We're sorry, we can't fit anyone on here." And you know, they didn't know if they would be able to, because it was actually a collapsible lifeboat, so they weren't sure if they flipped it over they'd be able to get inside properly and, you know, get the water out and all that. And there was one man who was like clinging to something that was floating, and he drifted by, and they were like, "Mate, we're sorry, we can't take you." And he said the words, "No worries, chaps, Godspeed," and floated off and was never seen again. And that's one of those stories that I'm telling you, that the bravery and just, I just think that is just so moving. So yeah, so there was me in the exhibit walking around carrying all these stories with me. A few people started to like lean in when I was telling my mom all these stories, but the exhibit did a great job of including quotes from a lot of people's stories. And like I said, you could get just one person's story from your ticket and then the tickets of whoever you were with. And I just thought that was brilliant. And then on an even more like tangible scale, they had parts that you could touch. So they had a piece of ice that they kept refrigerated when you got to the room, like you move through the classes and then you get to the room about the crash. You know, they've crashed into an iceberg and then people are getting in the water. And you touch this piece of ice just to see how cold it was, like how jarring it is to you know, be on this ship. And they were in their pajamas. It was the middle of the night. So you're in your pajamas. You've got this life vest attached to you if you're lucky. And then you touch this water and oh my God, it was freezing. It really was so jarring. I thought that was brilliant. And then a little bit further on, they were talking about the submarines and how they gathered things. My mom's favorite part of the exhibit was that they had photos of the objects and how they were laying on the seabed and then had them in that exact position right in front of you. One of them was a stack of dishes that had been in a wooden tray, and the wood had all rotted away. So these dishes were all stacked on the seabed floor as though they had just been washed and just left behind. But in that room as well, they also had a piece of the Titanic, a piece of the hull, piece of the steel hull that you could touch. I've touched the Titanic, you guys. Like, why anyone feels the need to go look at the rotting hull at the bottom of the sea, I don't know. Because I touched it on land, safe and dry, at this exhibit. Totally fine. Like, but to each their own, I guess. The exhibit, 10 out of 10. If not more. I loved it. I thought it was incredible. They really did pull in the human stories that are so important to me and to the Titanic, because that's what the Titanic is really about, is the fragility of life, of human life, and, you know, the horrifics of class structure and just it's such a microcosm. Like the Titanic is such a pinpoint of so much of immigration, because there were a lot of immigrants on the Titanic searching for a better life in the New World, and a lot of them, complete families, perished. It's a story of romance. Again, the Titanic movie gave you this romance, but do you know what's even more incredible than that, to me anyways? The Strausses. If you haven't heard of the Strausses, they're a couple who actually owned Macy's department store. I did not know that part until I was at the exhibit, but I knew this story from this book. And Mrs. Strauss was one of the first class ladies who perished because she was on, if you didn't know this, on one side of the boat, everyone who could get in a lifeboat, they were putting you in a lifeboat. On the other side of the boat, they were saying women and children only, and sending off half full lifeboats. And she and her husband were on that side of the ship. And they said, you know, your husband cannot go. And she said, okay, then neither will I. I will not leave him. I am going to stay with my husband. And she did. She stayed with him to the end. And you have that romantic story and you just give me, he could have fit on the door. So, yes. The Titanic, if you are in need of hope and just validation, you know, you don't want to be told everything's going to be fine and you want a safe place to feel your feelings, I highly recommend Real Titanic Stories or the Titanic exhibit if you ever have a chance to go and see it. However, and this is a big however, I do have some complaints. Mainly two. My first complaint is about people. As much as I was witnessing the incredible endurance of the human soul and the strength that some people showed during the sinking of the Titanic, I also witnessed incredible insensitivity and just people being absolute horrid humans at this exhibit. As I've said, a lot of people do not put the Titanic on the human scale that it is. It's a human tragedy. There are real people with real lives and real dreams and real ancestors still alive today. It's real. And there were people at this exhibit. It was incredibly crowded. I was very surprised. A lot of children, a lot of families, and a lot of people weren't taking it as seriously didn't have that level of respect, basic level of respect that I had hoped people would have. And that includes one man who we found one historian. There are like staff, like curator staff in the exhibit. We found one. Again, the exhibit had just opened and it was incredibly crowded, so there might have been more. But we found this one, and I was so excited and ready to go ask him questions and talk to him. But as I approached, I heard one adult man, a fully grown man, look at him and say, "So what are the best jokes about the Titanic that you know?" And I walked away because I wanted to punch that man in the face on behalf of all the people who lost their lives. You know, a few years ago, was it last year? I don't know. I was also enjoying some Titanic jokes. I do believe there is a time and place, you know, it's okay. But at an exhibit with these people who perished, with their real things, the only things left of their existence sitting before you, their toilet literally in front of you. This is not the time and place, buddy. Similarly, when we got to the part where you scan your boarding pass and find out what happened to you, there was a child who was very loudly going, "You lost!" if your person died. And this child's mother did yell at him for that, but I do not blame the child. I just don't understand how you go to something like this and go through the whole thing. And if I did that and my child did not understand that this is a real human tragedy and not a video game, I would be deeply concerned with the way I'm raising my child. And we would go to the beginning of that exhibit and start all over. And we'd be like, we're doing this again. Even if we ignore the people at the exhibit, I am still absolutely horrified by the gift shop. I'm you know what? You want a Titanic shot glass? Okay, girl, you go for it. You want the necklace from the movie? Okay, sure. I myself bought a little commemorative pin of the exhibit because I decorate my cubicle in pins at work. But when you have like a t-shirt that says Titanic crew for a child less than 5 feet away from the giant board that lists everyone who died in the Titanic, the majority of whom were crew members. Over 700 crew members died in the sinking, and they were the biggest tragedy. I find that deeply insensitive, and I also do not know how anybody would buy that or could buy that for their child. There were toys. There were weird toys that just you would find like at Disney World or something, and I did not understand why they thought this was the place for those. I really struggle also with their little polar bear dressed in the captain's uniform. But I think the worst of it, the crowning glory of how horrible and horrified I was, is an ice cube tray. An ice cube tray where you can make your ice cubes into the shape of icebergs and ships. People froze to death. People froze to death. People froze to death, and people witnessed other people freezing to death. That last lifeboat that I mentioned, one guy fell off in the middle of the night. Like, they survived, the guys in the middle survived from body heat, but one guy, he just slipped off, and actually one guy in the middle died, and then another guy just slipped off in the middle of the night and nobody noticed. Other boats, people were dragged out of the water but then froze to death. And again, most people were in their pajamas. They didn't have layers to share. Some who did. But people... The most haunting part of the Titanic for me is imagining that moment when all the screaming stopped. Because it would have been within an hour of the lights going out. Just screaming shouts of help to utter silence. But I don't want to end on that note. So I'm going to end with one of my favorite stories from this book, which was simply that on one of the lifeboats, the crew member in charge was not a kind person. He was probably someone who would ask for the best jokes about the Titanic at a Titanic exhibit. And he was very much a man of his time, incredibly racist, incredibly sexist. And he was on a lifeboat. He was trying to paddle away from survivors in the water. And the first class women who were in the boat said, no, we're going to go help people. So they start paddling themselves to help people. And they drag one survivor out of the water. And they saw that it was an Asian man. As I said, the Titanic was full of immigrants in the third class. Something you also don't see in the movie that much. But the man in charge of the lifeboat, the crew member, essentially said, he's not white, throw him back. And one of the first class ladies turned on him and she was like, we're going to throw you overboard in a hot minute. Shut up and sit down. And I love that woman. I don't know what her name was. The survivor account didn't know what her name was, but I love her. Just again and again, everywhere you look, there's just a lot of beauty, and they reduce it down to an ice cube tray, which was disappointing. And they didn't have a single book in the gift shop. I was like, oh, this boarding pass thing is so cool. I'm sure they have it compiled in a book where they have the list of what happened to everyone. No, nothing. So if anyone knows of a good, I do have a book. I haven't read it yet about survivors of the Titanic, but it's rather dense. And I literally just wanted a reference sheet. I just want the boarding pass cheat sheet. Why don't they have that? But if you made it to the end of this video, please drop me a heart, because I don't want ships or icebergs. Please drop me a heart, because these are beautiful stories and we all need a little more love right now. Hang in there, everyone. Cling to whatever lifeboat you got. Cling to the good friends. Share your warm blankets. Take care of each other. My mantra has been, as long as we continue to take care of each other, we will not lose the war. Or sink. Don't let your friends sink. Take care of each other. And I'll see you next time.